Welcome to the Plymouth Historical Society's first virtual presentation via the Zoom platform. My name is Dick Flanders of the Plymouth Historical Society Board and Program Committee, which also includes John Richards, Linda Barlick, and Mary Ann Hyde Saul. Other members of the board include our president, Louise McCormick, Rondi Gannon, Joyce Bruce, Kathy Hillier, Paul and Judy Floyd, and Mary Baldwin. This Zoom program is brought to you through our association with Pease Public Library. Many thanks to Library Director Diane Lynch for hosting us tonight. We are very pleased to have signed up for this. We are very pleased that you have signed up for this online presentation and welcome your feedback as to its success from your point of view. We have folks from as far away as South Carolina and Pennsylvania, as well as the North Country, joining us this evening. We're glad to see you guys with us. This program is only our second program for 2020, given the decision to suspend live programs at our museum due to the COVID-19 virus restrictions. Our limited meeting space precludes the ability to provide social distancing. The program committee has rescheduled several programs, which we plan on giving via Zoom this fall. Next month, on Wednesday, September 23rd, we have John Christ speaking on the history of the Pemigewasset hotels. Instructions for signing up for this presentation will be provided later. So it gives me great pleasure to introduce tonight's speaker, Marcia Schmidt Blaine, who will be speaking on Macabre attractions, the Willey slide in disaster tourism. Many of you remember Marcia from earlier talks on saving the mountains in New Hampshire and the founding of the White Mountain National Forest, and another on female tavern keepers in New Hampshire colonial government. So without further ado, I'll pass this over to Marcia. Marcia?
Thank you very much, Dick. I appreciate that very kind introduction. One of the things that I always admire about Plymouth Historical Society is that you're working really hard for the community and with the community, and just kudos to everybody involved. One of the things that you may have noticed when Dick was talking about some of the things I've talked about is that I love the White Mountains. And so a lot of the work that I do is about the White Mountains or in the White Mountains. We're, of course, lucky enough to live where people come to vacation, where they seek relaxation, where they find some kind of respite from their regular or our current abnormal lives. So when did people come to think of this area as a tourist area? What attracted them to this, what was then a wilderness area? So the Willey slide of 1826 is what really opened the mountains and created the culture and the economy of the present. A lot of you know a little bit about the Willeys and the Willey slide, but let me give you a super brief description before we talk about it in more detail. The summer of 1826 was an unusually dry one, kind of like this summer. On Monday, the 27th of August, a torrential rain came down. It poured for hours. In the narrow Crawford Notch Valley, the Saco River rose, the water saturated the mountainsides, and the Willey family, which then consisted of 2 parents, 5 children, and 2 hired hands, that lived in the notch miles from their nearest neighbors, woke up and heard the noise of either an avalanche or the rising river, and they ran out in the dark of the night trying to escape. Most likely they fled the house in terror and were swept up by the avalanche. But in a macabre twist of fate, their house survived the disaster untouched. Had the family stayed in their house, they would have been safe. Instead, they all perished in kind of an ironic twist that really drew national attention.
Hello?
Hello, if you can make yourself mute, that would be great. Thank you very much. So from the Willey disaster came recognition that the White Mountains as a source of that they were a source of attractive contradictions. They had inspiring beauty that existed in combination with imminent physical danger. And really Harold Finn's Gate of the Notch, T-Stage, of course, here gives you that feeling of real danger. It's also a place of breathtaking mountain grandeur all around them, but it was clearly an area that was environmentally fragile as well. So the Willey disaster attracted the attention of 19th century America in ways no other disasters of this type before had done. Why? Well, we're going to look at some of the reasons and why this tragedy played on and worked with a developing nationalism of the United States, the Romantic movement, and the national and economic changes that were coming to the White Mountains, coming to the nation, and really brought tourism to the White Mountains. But of course, this did not happen in a vacuum. Let's talk about what else was happening in 1826. You may know about Philip Kerrigan, the man who did the first real map of New Hampshire. Well, Philip Kerrigan in 1826 wrote a poem in which he called the New Hampshire the Granite State. So it was the first time that we received that nickname. He wrote it in, I wrote a poem in celebration of Lafayette's trip to Portsmouth. John Quincy Adams was the president then, and John C. Calhoun was the vice president. It was a time of immense, nasty, virulently awful gridlock in Washington, D.C. Yeah, it sounds familiar, doesn't it? John Adams and Thomas Jefferson both died on July 4th, 1826, just a few weeks before the Willey disaster. The first U.S. railroad was chartered in Quincy, Massachusetts in 1826, and Samuel Morey patented the first internal combustion engine. There was a panic, a major recession in 1826 as well. There was a religious revival movement that you may know as the Second Great Awakening, and it was in full swing. The movement emphasized the need for individuals to feel and to sense the spirit of salvation within themselves. The Romantic movement was also gaining sway. It was a movement that emphasized emotion and the senses as a way of knowing. The Romantics gloried in the power of nature, a power that was, to them, mysterious, all-consuming, and ultimately unknowable. And nationalism. There was a rising tide of nationalism. Odd because we're still heading towards the Civil War as well, but Americans were seeking ways that they were different from and better than Europe, especially Great Britain. Nationalists were just beginning to realize that while we didn't have any visible ruins, that the unique landscape of the United States was a potential source of pride. Well, back to what was happening in Crawford Notch. The first real road was developed in the Notch in 1785. The well-known traveler Theodore Dwight noted that the original road was 50 to 60 feet higher than the present turnpike and so steep that it was necessary to draw horses and wagons up with ropes. When Dwight wrote this, it was 1834, and the gap between the mountains was a mere 20 feet apart. This was truly rugged country. I can't tell the story of the Willeys, however, without talking about the Crawford family. In fact, an important source of information from this story, and of course about the Crawford family itself, comes from Lucy Crawford's History of the White Mountains. The Crawford story underlies the Willey story. As a matter of fact, the Willeys would probably not have come to Crawford Notch, or the Notch of the White Mountains as it was known then, had the Crawfords not been there and urged them to do so. From the settlement of the Crawfords in the Notch in 1792, they worked to really make sure that people came to the area, that roads were built, and they spent a lot of their time and earned a lot of income from maintaining the roads. They also took in travelers. When the 10th New Hampshire Turnpike through the Notch was opened in late 1806, the region's importance increased. Farmers and merchants to the north and the west of the Notch brought their goods through the Notch and then down to Portland. It's a regular way of a commercial traffic way, if you will. The travelers depended upon the Crawford family for accommodations and for supplies. Travel was easiest in the winter when they didn't have to contend with mud and with dust. In 1831, the New Hampshire Spectator reported, during the 5 days in the latter part of January last, 462 horse teams passed Abel Crawford's house. 462. He, of course, was not able to put them all up, but he put up as many people as he could and as many animals as he could, and some of them, of course, sleeping outside. Thus, you can tell the Notch was already a well-traveled commercial route before 1826, especially in the winter. But it was a place to travel through as quickly as possible, not a place to travel to. It really held no attraction for these travelers. By 1825, there were 3 inns, if you will, that provided accommodations for these commercial travelers. There was Ethan Allen Crawford's inn to the northern end of the Notch. There was the Willey's Inn that was about 6 miles below and right in the middle of Crawford Notch, and Abel Crawford's Inn was about 6 miles below that at the southern end of Crawford Notch. I'm going to show you a couple of woodcuts that were done by Marshall Tidd that now are at Dartmouth. Tidd did these with the idea that they would be in a later edition of Lucy Crawford's History of the White Mountains. That never happened, but these woodcuts are really fabulous. I'm going to show you a couple of them. So this is Tidd's Willey's before the slide. The notch in the middle, the house in the middle of Crawford Notch was called the Old Notch House. It had been occupied intermittently from the time it was built around 1792. In October 1825, the Willey family moved in. They planned to do some farming and, of course, to help to run an inn. So they were in the middle of breaking a 12-mile stretch for the commercial traffic that was going in. In 1825 to 26, there were, let me tell you a little bit about their family. There were Samuel Willey Jr. and Polly Lovejoy Willey. They married in 1812. They lived in what was then known as Lower Bartlett and is now known as North Conway for the first part of their marriage. And they were successful farmers. They had 5 children in 13 years, so they were also successful parents. In 1826, Samuel Willey was 38. Polly Willey was 35. They had children, 5 children. Eliza was the eldest. She was 13. Jeremiah was 11. Martha was 10. Elbridge was 7, and Sally was 3. Let's see what Lucy Crawford had to say about the Willey disaster in her history. Remember again that she wrote this history from the point of view of Ethan Allen Crawford. She wrote it as if she was her husband. So the I refers to Ethan Allen Crawford, not Lucy. And again, remember, this was a really dry summer. 1828, torrential rains, the hardest rain ever seen in the mountains, poured down. She wrote that the Crawfords awoke that next morning with our little boy coming into the room saying, "Father, the earth is nearly covered with water and the hogs are swimming for life." They had about 200 acres that were flooded. The bridge was gone. They could not get south. About 90 feet of their shed, which was attached to the barn, was ripped away. 14 sheep drowned. Water came within 18 inches of their front door. Their timber and wood was carried away. It was devastating for the Crawfords. Lucy continues. Now the safety of my father and the Willey family occupied our minds, but there was no way to find out their situation. They waited, and then the next person through was a traveler on foot, a merchant named Barker, who came through probably the day after the flood. He made his way down to the Notch House and arrived there just before dark. He found the house deserted by every living creature except the faithful dog, who was at first unwilling to admit a stranger. What must have been the feelings of this lonely traveler while occupying this deserted house, finding doors opened and beds and clothes as though they had left in a hurry, a Bible open and lying on the table as if it had been lately read. Barker told his story as he went south, and as Lucy put it, the news soon spread. Here's the Notch after the slide, according to Marshall Tidd. The next day, Ethan Allen and Thomas, his brother, Crawford, with a gentleman from Connecticut, went through the Notch. We found the road in some places entirely demolished. We found a gulf in the middle of the road, in some places 10 feet deep and 20 rods in length. The rest of the road, my pen would fail should I attempt to describe it. Suffice it to say, I could hardly believe my own eyes, the water having made such destruction. At the Willeys, they found the cows with their bags filled with milk, and from their appearance, they had not been milked for some days. Crawford was growing fearful about the Willey family. Where were they? The house was deserted. He returned the next day with more neighbors and family to search. Diligent search being made for them and no traces to be found until the night, when the attention of the people was attracted by the flies as they were passing and repassing underneath a large pile of floodwood. They now began to haul away the rubbish and at length found Mr. and Mrs. Willey, Mr. Allen, the hired man, and the youngest child not far distant from each other. These were taken up, broken and mangled, as much naturally be expected, and were placed in coffins. The next day they were interred on a piece of ground near the house, there to remain until winter. Saturday, the other hired man was found and interred, and on Sunday, the eldest daughter was found some way from where the others were, across the river. The other 3 children, 1 daughter and 2 sons, have never to this day been found. Not even a bone has been picked up or discovered. Lucy then wrote a line that really encapsulates this 19th century feeling that they took in once they heard of the disaster. What must have been the feelings of that family as they rushed from the house under the darkness of night, not knowing where to flee for safety from the mighty torrent of earth and water, which was hurrying itself along the valley beneath. This is Samuel Willey's book to the right, Benjamin Willey's book to the right. He was Samuel Willey's brother. And much of the rest of Willey's life was spent trying to figure out what happened to his brother. You'll notice as well that he was a minister and often used this story in his sermons. News of the tragedy quickly spread, first by word of mouth through the White Mountain communities, and then through newspapers in the Northeast and across the nation. The New Hampshire Patriot and State Gazette first published a written account in the September 4th edition. By September 15th, the Wilmington, Delaware newspaper had picked up the tale of the most melancholy and heartrending catastrophe in the White Mountains as their lead story. They wrote, "Amidst thundering of rocks, the crushing of trees, and the rushing of mud and water, these 9 souls fled out of the house for refuge. But alas, destruction was their lot. For when they came to the door, the 2 wings of the slip were ready to receive them. It was a horrid sight," the article continued, "an awful scene. Who can think upon it and not sigh? Whose eyes could not look upon the spot and not overflow with water?" So what did happen to the Willeys? We'll never really know. We'll never have the complete story. Whether the Willeys fled from the house in a panic as the avalanche struck and then it caught them around the stable, which was pretty much destroyed by the avalanche, or maybe they had taken refuge in another area and then were caught, or perhaps they heard the rising river of the Saco River and they went up the mountain and then were caught in the avalanche. Again, we'll never know, except that they clearly were caught in the avalanche and killed. Public interest in the Willeys' last hours grew, and people wanted to see where the Willeys had died, what their house was like, and to feel the terror of that night. This morbid curiosity brought people to the White Mountains who wanted to capture the emotions that the Willeys had experienced, to understand the destruction of the entire family, and to see the house and its artifacts. Why had God singled them out? Why would he allow them to die and the house to survive? Why did the slide kill them but leave their house untouched? So drawn by this macabre disaster, a new group of people journeyed to New Hampshire's mountains. These were primarily adventurous, wealthy, urban dwellers, and then other people who were in some ways supported by the same, mainly artists. Here's a stereograph from the Museum of the White Mountains, for which I thank them. The Willey house and the slide. You can see, the reason I wanted to show you this, if you look behind the house, you can still see the slide years and years after the actual Willeys had been killed. This is a hotel that was later built right next to the Willey house. So the house itself is this tiny little house back here behind the barn. By the fall of 1826, the Crawfords recognized the growing interest in the Willeys, and as much as they missed their friends, realized that they could profit from the influx of tourists. The Crawfords had been directly affected by the storm. Ethan Allen's property suffered over $1,000 worth of damage, which was a huge amount in 1826. And his father's farm had been wrecked almost beyond repair. But they were also affected in a positive manner with this subsequent influx of tourists. The historian Donna Brown, who wrote Inventing New England, writes, Crawford was the inventor, the organizer, and the driving force of the White Mountains tour. Others sought to benefit as well. Historian again, Brown, believes that artists such as Thomas Cole and writers such as Nathaniel Hawthorne used the interest in the tragedy to propel their careers. They deliberately painted and wrote about an area that had suddenly gained national prominence. Their work spread the story even more broadly. Let's focus for a minute on Thomas Cole. Thomas Cole is really well known for his allegorical representations that he did later in life, but at this point he was a young artist, really just getting going. He had done some painting over in the Adirondacks, but was essentially commanded to come to the White Mountains by his patron, Daniel Wadsworth. So Wadsworth had visited the White Mountains in late 1826 and had seen the Willey's house. He sent Cole a detailed travel agenda and urged him to go in 1827. So in July 1827, Cole reported that after a dreary and uninteresting ride from Boston to the mountains, he found himself surrounded, as he put it, by an ocean of beauty and magnificence. It is here in such sublime scenes that man sees his own nothingness and the soul feels unutterably. The scene was far beyond my expectations and is the finest one I have ever beheld. How kind has the Creator been to us. Nature opens her treasures and a rich banquet is ever spread for our enjoyment. How could, though, a landscape of such beauty have produced such terror? We know that Cole produced a painting based on the Willey disaster, but that painting has been lost. We do have a lithograph that was made from that painting, and that's what you're seeing here. Cole returned with a friend, Henry Cheever Pratt, in 1828. This is a drawing by Merrick Bennett, who I quite admire. He calls himself a cartoonist and a storyteller. He's a graphic novelist and he does amazing work. If you ever look for him, I urge you to, because his work is really outstanding. So in 1828, Cole returned to the White Mountains accompanied by New Hampshire native and artist Henry Cheever Pratt. Art historian Catherine Campbell wrote about their trip in an article that Historical New Hampshire published called Two's Company. During the storm that killed the Willey family, the Notch Road was virtually destroyed. When Cole passed through in 1828 with Pratt, 2 years after the storm that killed the Willeys, he wrote, "We had before us that wild mountain pass called the Notch, through which descends a rapid river without bridges. These, with the roads, have been washed away by the late floods. This road is impassable, except to foot travelers." Their progress through the Notch was clearly difficult, and the weather was foreboding. They used fallen trees to cross the Saco River, and Cole wrote, "It required no little courage to venture on such precarious bridges with the rapid stream rushing beneath, but it was worth it." He wrote, "We now entered the Notch and felt awestruck as we passed between the bare and rifted mountains that rose on either side to thousands of feet above." Cole, of course, was a professional artist. He sought money for his work. while hoping that his art would provide viewers with an understanding that a benevolent and nurturing spirit was present in the wilderness, and that that same spirit could turn on visitors as well. He reveled in what raw nature could reveal. Here is a sketch Cole did. It's down at the Princeton Art Gallery, and they feel it was probably drawn in 1839, which is when he came back again. Here's what he wrote, and the sketches of the Willey house, and he's imagining it at the time of the Willey slide. Here's what he wrote about it, though. The sight of that deserted dwelling standing in a little patch of green in the midst of that dread wilderness of desolation called to mind the horrors of that night, the 28th of August, 1826. The whole family perished, and yet, had they remained in the house, they would have been saved. Though the slides rushed on either side, they avoided the house as though it had been a sacred place. This strange mystery hangs over the events of that night. How awful must have been the darkness of that night, with the crash of falling crags and the rushing of cataracts. It is impossible for description to give an adequate idea of the scene of desolation. After making some sketches, he then wrote, we proceeded up the valley. Word of the disaster spread beyond the artist and the newspapers, and so did news of the beauty that was found there. Commerce began to grow around this increasing new market. Industrialism had freed some people from constant work. These people who had some leisure began to come to see the mountains. This is from an article that was written by Diana Korensik, and it was published in Historical New Hampshire. One of the things I want to point out is that it's done by Fanny Appleton, and she later married Longfellow, the poet. So soon after the death of her mother, 15-year-old Frances, or better known as Fanny, Elizabeth Appleton and her family made a 2-month tour of the northern United States. This was 1833. They used the Fashionable Tour, a guidebook that was first published in 1828. Fanny's father was a banker. He was one of the founders of the Lowell Mills. He was also a congressman. He was a wealthy man, and this wealthy Boston family, in their grief, hired a private coach and stayed in small hotels and taverns, the best that money could then buy. In the 1828 Fashionable Tour, the author noted that the number of visitors to the White Mountains has considerably increased on account of the interest excited by these avalanches. The most sublime view of them may be seen all along for several miles passing through the notch. The country around, however, is still wild and unimproved, displaying a succession of bold and lofty mountain scenery. Again, you may want to see Diana Korensik's 2009 article in Historical New Hampshire for more about Fanny Appleton. But they're a good example, the Appletons are a good example of the wealthy who began to see what was happening up in the White Mountains. Other people came as well. Around the same time that Charles Codman painted this painting of the Notch, one of my favorite ones, but it clearly shows the glacial past of the Notch. About the same time, in 1831, newlyweds Mary and Moses Thomas borrowed a one-horse carriage from her father, and they traveled to the White Mountains for their wedding trip. As part of their trip, now this was their honeymoon, mind you, they stopped to see the Willey house in the Notch. Mary remembered, our next stop was the Willey house in the Notch, which had remained closed just as it was left by the frightened inhabitants when that awful avalanche occurred, where amidst the war of the elements and the descending rocks and trees, the whole household perished. No one had been found willing to occupy the house since. We could see through the windows, the table with the crockery left by an unfinished meal, a tea kettle, an iron pot, and some other cooking utensils on the hearth. The site had become an American ruin, if you will, for early White Mountain adventure travelers. Mary continued, relic hunters with Yankee blades were hacking off pieces of furniture to keep as souvenirs. It was not unusual for the time period. This is a stereo view from the Museum of the White Mountains. And if you look, you can see the road, just the road. You can also see, if you look closely, a much larger Crawford house behind it, but there's no railroad or anything. And I wanted you to see what the notch could have looked, or excuse me, did look like in a photograph before it was much broadened when the railroad came through. It was even more broadened even with the roads. So this is a very narrow notch. So how did people get to Crawford Notch? At first, with difficulty. Beginning in 1831, a tourist stage left Portland at 5 a.m. 3 times a week and arrived in Conway, New Hampshire at 5 p.m. Tourists could stay there and from there find transportation to the Notch of the White Mountains, as it was called. By 1834, stage companies added stages through the Notch to the northern presidentials and then on to the northern limits of Franconia Notch for the convenience and the accommodation of travelers and visitors to the White Hills. It was a difficult route, very uncomfortable, but the White Mountain stage line promised that, quote, if the proprietors should receive sufficient encouragement, they will run during the summer season a daily stage from the White Mountains to Littleton. They did, and they did. Here is the Willey house here, with an addition that the Willeys have begun, and then you can also see the later addition of the hotel. In 1841, 2 leading US abolitionists, William Lloyd Garrison and then Plymouth's own Nathaniel Peabody Rogers, traveled through the mountains. Rogers published his thoughts in the abolitionist newspaper that he edited, called the Herald of Freedom. Now here's his quote on Crawford Notch. He saw it 15 years and 1 day after the slide. Everything looks as if lightning and thunder had struck it, or a volcano hove it up, or earthquake rent it, or deluge flooded and washed it away. Rocks and gravel and sand that have come down in slides from the mountains all along the Notch for half a dozen miles present you with a hideous picture, relieved by nothing but its vastness. About the Willey house itself, he wrote, we went into the bedrooms where the slumbers of the ill-fated inmates had been broken on that terrible night by the noise of the slide, and into the kitchen where they had lived, with the desolate hearth around which they had often gathered, and heard the evening storms howling through the Notch. The old cupboards and the chambers, we explored all, where these, our fellow creatures, had once occupied. The walls and the plasterings were scrawled with names. We wrote Brother Garrison's and our own, linked together on the walls with a fragment of coal. Note, 15 years after the slide, and the house was still open for people to just come into and put themselves in the Willey shoes. And to add, if you will, a memorial to the Willeys by adding their names. But they were some of the last to get to walk through the ruins. In 1845, the house was opened for guests to stay in. And the hotel that you can just barely see in this slide was added immediately adjacent. So those sublime and emotional feelings that romantics had associated with the Willeys family experience had been captured and really molded by commercialism. Commerce had clashed with the ideal, and commerce won. This is a daguerreotype, one of the first ever done in the United States. It's owned by the George Eastman House, and this daguerreotype. Okay, so I'm a historian. I get goosebumps every time I see it because this is Abel Crawford's Inn at the southern end of the Notch. Remember that daguerreotypes are mirror images of reality. So this is 1841. That's the same year that Garrison and Rogers saw the Willey house. So the railroads began to arrive in the White Mountains in 1851. After that, the region had a much broader geographic reach. Suddenly, it was possible to begin the day in New York City and end it at a White Mountains hotel. Some contemporaries were fully aware that the changes that this wrought, and some did not consider it to be all for the better. In July 1858, the Boston Post published a long article entitled "The White Mountain Journey, 25 years ago and today." And let me quote just a little bit of it. 25 years ago at the Willey house, no guide demanded a fee. The visitor poked about the ruin with his gloomy reflections, undistraught by a talking automaton's recital. There was no let or hindrance to chipping off and taking away as much of the woodwork of the house as we wanted for a memorial. But today, its sublimity and desolation is all gone. The new paint, the fixing up, the enlarged windows, carefully shut door, the proprietary air of all seems to mock at the unique sorrow of the Willey house. The roads are worse now than they were then because the railroads that skirt the eastern and western bases of the mountains have absorbed the heavy transportation, and the turnpikes have gone bankrupt. Close quote. The majority of people, however, did not agree with him, and they continued to flock to the site of the Willey slide. And they began to go to other places as well. To entertain tourists who had been drawn to the Willey tragedy and to encourage them to stay longer, locals amplified and created local attractions for travelers and tourists. The Old Man had been discovered in 1805 by a surveying expedition through Franconia Notch, and was almost instantly compared to George Washington. Tourists were mystified by the flume and that rock that was stuck in the middle of it, and were absolutely astounded when that rock was removed by a flood in 1883. They were awed, and many were also terrified, riding up Mount Washington on the Cog Railway. And they wrote about it privately and publicly, some well and some not so well. One of the first writers to arrive in the Notch after the tragedy was Nathaniel Hawthorne. He wrote The Ambitious Guest, which centered on the Willey tragedy. In it, he left the Willeys unnamed because of their fame. He said, "Who has not heard their name?" And then he said, "Alas, they had quitted their security and fled right into the path of destruction. Down came the whole side of the mountain in a cataract of ruin, long ere the thunder of the great slide had ceased to roar among the mountains. The mortal agony had been endured and the victims were at peace." This was first published in 1835 and revised in 1842. The front piece that you see of a sketch of the destruction of the Willey family was written by Edward Melcher. Melcher was the only survivor of the party who discovered and removed the bodies of the unfortunate family. Now, notice that was 1826. This was published in 1880. Both of those are good pieces of literature. I love Franklin Leavitt's maps, but his poetry doesn't do it for me. Here's a piece, a poem that he published in 1885. 1826, the Willey mountain down did slip. It missed the house and hit the barn. If they'd all stayed in, they'd met no harm. It being the dark of night, the Willey family took a fright. And out of the house they all did run, and on to them the mountains come. It buried them all up so deep, they did not find them for 3 weeks. And 3 of them they never found. They were buried there so deep in the ground. Well, let's look at a Leavitt map. Franklin Leavitt was a native of Lancaster, and he was a local character who provided tourists what they wanted. He worked variously as a woodsman, a hunter, a mountain guide, a laborer at the Notch House, and a builder of the Alpine House in Gorham. He also helped to construct a couple of paths up Mount Washington. Now, when you're looking at this particular map, it's the 1882 version of his maps. He did a whole series of maps of the White Mountains, and I blew up a little piece of it so you can see the Willey family is right here. This is also Ethan Allen Crawford killing a bear, but as you can see right here. Excuse me, that's old Crawford, Abel Crawford. But you can see the Willeys fleeing from the slide. His maps, as art historian David Tatum has said, were cartographically ludicrous. Yet, when viewed as souvenirs for tourists, they make sense and they're really wonderful pieces of folk art. The first map was published in 1852. It was the first published map of the White Mountains ever. 7 White Mountain maps followed, with the last one being in 1888. My favorite one is the 1859 map, which contains more words than any map ever should. This is again the 1882 map. Now they are folk art. They're intended as tourist souvenirs and as a very general guide. But what they did do is they alerted travelers to the area's principal sites. The maps told stories. They drew attention to hotels. They showed railroads and roads. They identified major mountains. They pointed out important sites to see. Remember again that Leavitt was from Lancaster. Perhaps that's why he presented the mountains from his perspective, with south being at the top of the map. They show the mountains as one would have seen them if viewing it from the north. That was one exception, but all of the rest of his maps use the opposite orientation from the one we're used to. But his maps did celebrate the unique beauty of the American White Mountains. And travelers came. The Willey site remained and remains a popular tourist destination and stop. When the AMC was formed in 1876, during their first summer, they went up to the Willeys. As they wrote, one notable event sponsored by the club was a hike up to the top of Mount Willey on the 28th of August, 1876, to commemorate the 50th anniversary of the disaster. Moses Sweetser, whom I quote here, he wrote guidebooks and wrote a series of later guidebooks, wrote of the Willey House, telling tourists with leisure time and curiosity what to expect. Now notice the part that I've made in bold. In the rear is the remnant of the great rock which sheltered the house by splitting the avalanche in its course towards it, and the track of the slide may be easily be ascended for considerable distance beyond through a scattered forest of birch trees. Below the house is a pile of stones, which shows where the bodies of several of the Willeys were found. This is a picture of modern Mount Willey. There were rock and mudslides in the White Mountains before and after the Willey slide. But the story of the Willeys remains best known because the house remained untouched and because it was a well-timed disaster. The Willeys' sensational deaths were picked up by the social media of the day, newspapers, and repeated. Artists came to paint, creating really truly American art, and it spread throughout the country, not only in its actual form, but also through reproduction and lithographs and prints. Descriptions of the disaster intrigued tourists. Was this God's handiwork, or could there be a natural explanation? How can the quiet nature of Crawford not have been so violent? Various new disciplines, such as geology, botany, and zoology, became fashionable in the late 1820s, and the narrow notches of the White Mountains furnished a nearby laboratory for research. Locals were intrigued by the results of the slide for quite a different reason. In the early 19th century, farmers in New England had been doing well raising sheep. So well, as a matter of fact, that they produced a wool glut, and the market collapsed. By 1835, the New Hampshire farmers were beginning to move to new farming regions opening up in the Midwest or to industrial areas like Lowell and Lawrence. But some families stayed behind. They survived by adding a new trade to their farm economy. They kept their houses open for tourists. Many small town taverns and individual homeowners used this new traffic to make ends meet. The Willey disaster was well-timed in another way as well. Americans were on the cusp of a period of impassioned nationalism. And the White Mountains, accessible yet wild, were viewed by some as a symbol to represent the still young nation. They could be viewed, the mountains could be viewed as an expression of American optimism and potential. So we're back to our original slide. The Willey disaster was an American cultural event. Scientists visited and wrote about the Willey avalanche. Ministers used the disaster as the basis for lessons. Poets such as Lydia Sigourney and Grenville Mellon wrote long romantic poems about the incident. Artists arrived to sketch the woeful scene, and writers like Nathaniel Hawthorne used the Willey slide as the basis for novels and short stories. The tragedy of the Willey family brought together many threads that remain the part of the fabric of New Hampshire today. Farmers turned to hosting tourists, merchants found ways to profit from it, and the artist popularized the uniquely American region while writers explained the best way to appreciate what they saw. Transportation brought increasing numbers of people and the growing middle class to vacation in the White Mountains. And leisure time was increasingly available to the growing industrialists and the people who worked for them in the 19th century. Undeniably, there were haunting aspects to the Willey's story, the loss of the entire family in a natural disaster that indiscriminately killed them all, and yet the house preserved just as they had left it, the faithful family dog who would not leave, the bodies that were never found, that sense of dark and a preventable disaster that nonetheless simply would not let the Willeys escape their fate. The legend took root in American psyche. The Willey disaster changed tourism, travel, and New Hampshire. I also want to point out that the next historical New Hampshire that comes out will contain a larger and longer version of this particular talk with additional slides and a slightly different name. You'll notice I've changed the name to Disaster's Lure. And you're welcome to find out more about it from that. But I'm also happy to take any questions that you might have. Diane.
Marcia, we have somebody that has a couple of questions that they've brought in through chat. Mr. Howard Frederick writes, Marcia, did your article on this topic appear yet? And can you give us the URL?
And the answer is no, I cannot, because it's coming out as a matter of fact, I got the page proofs today.
Oh.
COVID-19 slowed a lot of stuff down. I believe they're going to call this the spring-summer edition of Historical New Hampshire, and it should be out very soon. And so I'll let you know when it does.
Okay, and the follow-up to that was, how was it that the turnpike and the railroad went up through Crawford Notch rather than through Franconia Notch? Was it the power of the tavern keepers or some benevolent politician?
So one of the reasons that they went through Crawford Notch first is because Crawford Notch was already a commercial way. And by the time they started thinking about Franconia Notch, there were enough people concerned with the fragility of the old man, and of course this played out when the interstate went through there as well, that they were able to convince them not to come up. So what the railroads did instead is they went around the mountains to the northern part of the mountains and came down to the Profile House and the other inns that were in that area. So there were no large inns in Franconia Notch. So as you point out, I mean, business people certainly had an important part to play. And so it didn't go through early enough. And people were concerned enough about what they saw in Franconia Notch to not let the railroad go through. Really good question though.
So Mr. Frederick has another question, but I don't know if somebody else has one in the meantime. He has a comment and a question. All right, I'm gonna go ahead. So the bronze plaque at the Crawford Notch State Park Tourist Shop commemorates the Willey Slide tragedy, but it has the date and year of 1925 on it and the inscription of the Daughters of the American Revolution. As we approach the 200th anniversary in 2026, Shouldn't we start an effort to re-commemorate the site and update the bronze marker and put something more sensible on it? Can you please comment on the impact of the Willey slide on the 19th century religion, particularly the issue of free will and destiny? Did the slide influence preachers, ministers, particularly Congregationalists and Unitarians? Oh my.
Wow. First, you're right about the DAR's plaque. Yes, Howard, be replaced. I absolutely agree. And with the anniversary coming up in just a few short years, we should be talking to the people who do the historical markers and see if we can get that one replaced. I agree. As far as religion goes, I hesitate to say too much, in part because it's not my area of expertise. I'm really an 18th century historian, except for a White Mountains historian. And so, Howard, I'm going to ask you to talk to probably Becky Noel and some of my historian friends, and probably get better answer, especially on the issue of free will, which is a big topic.
So we have another comment from John Christ. Forgive me if I'm mispronouncing your last name. I think maybe I just gave you quite a title. Thank you so much for the wonderful talk. I love the Levitt map because the map, the terrain as we see it rather than through traditional cartographic tools, which do not match most of our lived spatial experiences. In other words, rather than folk art and not proper cartography, why not alternative means of envisioning geography? The question is, I'm interested in a more philosophical question, the difference in vision and conception between artists like Cole and more general public. Philosophically and to some extent artistically, certainly for Cole, sublime is opposed to the beautiful. For many of us today, seem almost synonymous. I sometimes wonder about this question and don't really have a firm answer in my mind. Did I read that to your satisfaction?
John,
Yeah.
Really good question. So John is an art historian, amongst other things. John, you're amazing. So John, I absolutely agree, especially when you think of Cole and the sublime. Donna Brown in Inventing New England has a whole chapter that really looks at this issue of what the sublime was in the 19th century, and this understanding that it was a deep felt need to feel what people felt and to see the beauty and to understand it deeply. They expected to be moved to tears. There's a really interesting piece that Louisa May Alcott did. She went to visit her cousins just before she did any of her writing. Went to visit her cousins up in the White Mountains in 1861, and she talks about going to the top of Mount Washington and finding a quiet nook for herself and being completely overwhelmed with this feeling of awe from being in the mountains. So even that late, we're still hearing this issue of the sublime, even when commercialism is beginning to take over and mold what had been seen in the 19th century. So yeah, I absolutely agree with you. This issue of the sublime is something that I think anybody who looks at the early 19th century gets caught up in, because it was one of the leading drivers that brought people to the White Mountains. Now, Thomas Cole, of course, really changed the direction of the way he took his art after a few years. But at this point, he's still very much into the grandeur of what he saw.
Thank you. It was a great talk.
Thanks, John.
I was just even more pointedly, just we can probably talk about this another day, perhaps. But for a lot of people, like philosophically, like Kant and Burke and people like that, the sublime was terrifying. It was the antithesis of beauty. There was nothing beautiful about the sublime, and yet they've come to be synonymous somehow. And
They have.
And
so
for Cole, they weren't quite. They were almost, but they weren't quite.
Well.
Yeah. Anyway, it's a big topic. Another day.
Hey, I'm on sabbatical this fall. Love to talk.
Marcia, we have another question from Tricia Peony. Forgive me if I'm mispronouncing your last name. Are there other examples of sites of disaster tourism in the 19th century that you might compare with this? Thank you.
Yeah, Tricia, you know, it's funny. When I was working on the article that's coming out, it's one of the things that I was speaking to the editor about. She said, well, if this is pulling in people, other things must have too. I think probably the clearest one that has a nice parallel to it would be the Johnstown flood down in New York, as an example, where people went to see where the dam had broken and killed all the people that were in Johnstown. So I think that's a good example of one. But it, you know that saying that the news leads with what leads? There's still this fascination, if you will, with people's disasters. And so it's not something that I think we can just solely put on, you know, the morbid fascination of the 19th century, although they did have a morbid fascination. But I think there's still some of that within us as well as part of human nature.
I'm not seeing further questions in chat.
Well, the timing is perfect. I'll turn it back over to Dick. Thank you, everyone. I enjoyed it. If you have any more questions, feel free to let me know and I'll try to answer them. I'm also happy to just talk.
Great. Thank you, Marcia. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Excellent. Fascinating program. And thanks, Diane, for hosting our presentation tonight. Very helpful.
You're very welcome.
Thank you all for participating via Zoom and for continuing to support Pease Public Library as well as the Plymouth Historical Society.